When the anxious finally decides to step back, something profound begins to unfold inside them. For so long, their energy has been directed outward, pouring effort into holding on, chasing, and fixing what feels broken. They convince themselves that if they just try harder, give more, or explain themselves one more time, maybe this time it will click, maybe this time the avoidant will soften and meet them halfway. But what the anxious doesn't always realize is that this constant cycle isn't just exhausting, it becomes an identity. They start to believe their worth is tied to what they can do to keep the other person engaged, and when they stop chasing, it is not just an act of silence toward the avoidant, it is a moment of reclaiming their own sense of power. This is not about a game, not about manipulation, but about shifting out of a role that never allowed them to breathe or feel safe. It's about breaking the cycle where they were always the one to reach out, always the one to repair, always the one who carried the fear of loss, while the avoidant carried the comfort of distance. That first step of ignoring, of not reacting, feels terrifying at the beginning. The anxious is wired to respond, to overanalyze every silence, to imagine worst-case scenarios if they don't fill the space. But when they resist that instinct, they begin to notice how much calmer they feel in their own presence. Instead of constantly running after crumbs, they start to redirect that energy inward. They realize that the more they chase, the more the avoidant retreats, and the more they step back, the more they finally breathe. Ignoring in this context doesn't mean shutting down emotionally or pretending not to care. It means choosing not to engage in a cycle that never gave them peace. For the anxious, this becomes a revelation, because for the first time they get a glimpse of what life feels like when their energy is not consumed by waiting for a message, dissecting a word, or managing another person's distance. That silence creates space for them to see that their value exists without constantly proving it. From the perspective of the avoidant, this shift feels foreign. They have been used to the anxious filling every gap, smoothing over every tension, rushing in to maintain connection. The avoidant's entire comfort zone rests on the knowledge that they can withdraw without real consequences, because the anxious will always be there to bridge the gap. When that no longer happens, the avoidant is left with a silence that isn't just quiet. It's uncomfortable, it's disruptive, it forces them to sit in the space they once counted on being filled. Suddenly, the power dynamic changes. What once made the avoidant feel in control now leaves them unsettled, because distance doesn't feel as safe when there is no one closing it. It is in this silence that the avoidant begins to feel the absence of what they once took for granted, and that realization often comes with an uncomfortable awareness that their patterns are being reflected back to them in a way they can no longer escape. For the anxious, this shift is not only about how the avoidant reacts, but about what they themselves discover. They begin to learn that ignoring in this sense is actually about choosing peace over chaos, self-respect over desperation. Each moment they resist the urge to chase, they strengthen a new pattern within themselves. They discover that the world doesn't collapse if they don't send that text, that someone's silence does not define their worth, that their happiness is not tethered to someone who cannot consistently meet them where they are. It is a slow unlearning, and with each step they find more freedom. This is how the anxious begins to transform their own identity, from someone who is dependent on another person's validation to someone who validates themselves through boundaries, self-awareness, and patience. It is in this very act that they finally begin to understand what real control looks like. Not control over someone else, but control over their own emotions and actions. This moment of reclaiming power marks the true beginning of change. The anxious learns that stepping back is not losing, it is choosing differently. They see how silence can be louder than 1,000 explanations, how restraint can carry more weight than pursuit. They come to understand that the avoidant only had power because the anxious kept feeding the cycle, and when they stop, the cycle breaks. The anxious realizes that they don't have to constantly prove their worth to anyone who doesn't value it, and that shift becomes the foundation for healthier patterns, healthier relationships, and a stronger sense of self. What once felt impossible ignoring instead of chasing, becomes the act that changes everything, not just in how the avoidant perceives them, but in how they perceive themselves. And once that shift begins, the anxious is no longer defined by fear of loss, but by the power of choosing themselves again and again. When the avoidant begins to feel the absence of validation and attention, the shift is undeniable. For so long, their dynamic with the anxious has been shaped by the constant reassurance the anxious provides. The avoidant knows, even subconsciously, that they can withdraw, pull back, or create distance without losing connection, because the anxious is always there to chase, to question, to overcompensate. That safety net allows the avoidant to maintain their patterns of detachment without facing the real consequences of their behavior. But when the anxious stops feeding into that cycle, the avoidant is suddenly faced with something unfamiliar, silence that doesn't bend to their comfort. It is in that space that they begin to realize how much of their sense of security depended on someone else constantly reaching for them. This absence is not just quiet, it feels like a mirror reflecting their own avoidance back at them, and it forces them into an awareness they are rarely prepared to confront. The lack of validation unsettles them because validation was never just about affection, it was about control. The anxious person's constant reassurance served as confirmation that no matter how much the avoidant pulled away, they would still be desired, still be pursued, still be wanted. It gave them the luxury of maintaining distance without fear of abandonment. But the moment that energy is withdrawn, the avoidant feels the ground shift beneath them. They begin to notice the emptiness that comes when no one is rushing in to fill the space they leave behind. The absence of those texts, calls, or attempts to bridge the gap suddenly makes the avoidant question what they thought was guaranteed. Their comfort zone begins to crack, and within those cracks is a discomfort that feels both foreign and threatening, because it undermines the very dynamic that allowed them to feel safe in their detachment. This discomfort often brings out unexpected reactions. Some avoidants may try to test the waters, sending mixed signals, small breadcrumbs, or subtle attempts to provoke the anxious into re-engaging. They might suddenly check in after periods of silence, not out of genuine intimacy, but out of a need to re-establish the old rhythm where they held the power. When that doesn't work, when the anxious continues to resist and hold back, the avoidant is forced to confront the possibility that they may no longer have the same control over the situation. For someone used to dictating the pace and depth of connection, this loss of influence can feel destabilizing. They are not used to being the one who wonders, the one who questions, the one who feels the ache of uncertainty. Yet, in this role reversal, they begin to experience the very unease that the anxious has always carried, and that revelation shakes the foundation of their carefully maintained distance. The absence of attention becomes more than just a void, it becomes a teacher. For the avoidant, it brings to the surface the realization that connection is not as guaranteed as they assumed. They start to see that detachment, while protective, is also isolating, and that without the anxious person constantly bridging the gap, their world feels lonelier and colder than they expected. This doesn't always lead to immediate transformation, but it does plant a seed of awareness. It highlights the cost of their patterns, the emotional toll of always holding people at arm's length, and the fragility of a dynamic that only worked as long as someone else carried the weight of connection. This seed of discomfort often lingers, pressing on them in moments of solitude, reminding them that their avoidance has consequences beyond just temporary space. It has the power to create permanent loss. For the anxious, witnessing this shift is powerful, even if they don't see the full internal struggle of the avoidant. By choosing not to provide constant validation, they inadvertently force the avoidant into a confrontation with themselves. This is not about playing games or trying to make the avoidant suffer. It's about no longer sacrificing their own peace to maintain a cycle that never brought them security. The anxious begins to see how stepping back alters the balance of power, and in that shift they find clarity. They realize that the avoidant's calm detachment was never as effortless as it seemed. It was sustained by the anxious feeding the connection. And without that, the avoidant feels the void too. This awareness gives the anxious a new kind of strength. The knowledge that their silence can carry weight, their absence can be felt, and their worth does not require them to constantly perform for love. In this moment, both sides are forced into a new awareness. One feels the loss of validation, the other feels the strength of withholding it, and together that marks the beginning of a shift that changes everything. Silence from the anxious creates an atmosphere the avoidant is rarely prepared to face. For the anxious, every instinct once told them to respond immediately, to over-explain, to fill the gaps with words or gestures that reassured the other person of their presence. Breaking this habit is not easy because silence for the anxious used to feel like rejection, a void that needed to be closed at all costs. But when they resist the urge and instead allow that silence to remain, they begin to realize that it is not a weakness but a strength. This silence is not passive, it is intentional. It communicates a boundary without the need for long conversations or explanations that often fall on deaf ears. It says more than words ever could, because it shifts the emotional responsibility back onto the avoidant. The anxious no longer carries the burden of always bridging the distance, and in doing so, they create a new kind of pressure that the avoidant has never experienced before. For the avoidant, this silence is deeply unsettling. They have built a comfort zone around the assumption that the anxious will always be there, ready to soothe the tension whenever they create space. Silence disrupts that expectation. Where they once expected messages or emotional efforts to pour in, they now find nothing. That nothingness feels louder than any argument or plea because it leaves them with their own thoughts and insecurities. Silence becomes a mirror, forcing them to hear the echoes of their own avoidance. They are left wondering whether the connection is slipping, whether the anxious has truly stepped back for good, and whether their detachment has finally pushed too far. This internal questioning is foreign to the avoidant, and it gnaws at the very foundation of the safety they thought they had built. What makes silence so powerful is that it creates uncertainty in the avoidant, and uncertainty is something they are not used to feeling in these dynamics. In the past, the anxious always absorbed the uncertainty, always carried the emotional instability of the relationship, always filled the silence so that the avoidant never had to feel it. But now, with no one rushing in to restore the balance, the avoidant begins to experience the same unease the anxious carried for so long. This reversal of roles forces them to confront emotions they have long avoided. They begin to feel the discomfort of waiting, the anxiety of not knowing where they stand, and the weight of wondering whether their patterns have cost them something valuable. Silence does what endless talking never could. It forces reflection, because there is nowhere else for the avoidant to look but inward. For the anxious, practicing silence also opens a new door within themselves. They learn that they do not always have to over-explain or overextend in order to be worthy of love. They begin to find peace in restraint, in knowing that their voice carries more weight when it is not used to chase, but to express only when necessary. Silence allows them to reclaim their energy and focus it inward into self-respect and healing. They start to feel grounded in the understanding that not every gap has to be filled, not every distance has to be closed. This realization helps them break free from the cycle that once defined their role in the relationship. Silence becomes a tool not of withdrawal, but of empowerment. A way of saying that they will no longer exhaust themselves to maintain a connection that does not flow both ways. In this silence, the dynamic shifts dramatically. The avoidant is pushed into unfamiliar territory, feeling the weight of uncertainty and the sting of absence. The anxious discovers the power of restraint and the calm that comes from not always reacting. The very act of withholding words and actions becomes transformative, not because it is meant to punish, but because it forces both people to confront realities they have been avoiding. For one, it is the reality that detachment has consequences. For the other, it is the reality that peace can exist without constant pursuit. This silence, once feared, becomes the turning point where the anxious stops playing the role they were trapped in, and the avoidant starts to feel the imbalance that once worked only in their favor. The anxious often spend so much of their emotional energy believing that their worth is tied to how much they can give, how much they can do, and how much they can sacrifice to keep a connection alive. Their identity becomes entangled with the role of the fixer, the pursuer, the one who holds on when the other person pulls away. But when they begin to ignore the avoidant, when they stop pouring constant validation and stop making endless attempts to close the distance, they are faced with a revelation that shakes everything they thought to be true. They start to see that their value is not dependent on convincing someone else to choose them. Their worth is not measured by their ability to repair a bond that the other person is unwilling to nurture. This realization changes everything because it allows the anxious to see themselves not through the lens of what they can give to someone else, but through the lens of what they already are. When the anxious resist the urge to chase, they begin to notice how much lighter they feel. They are no longer checking their phone every minute, no longer dissecting every silence, and no longer creating stories about what they did wrong. That mental space is suddenly freed, and in that space, they start to reconnect with themselves. They begin to explore their own interests, their own peace, and their own growth. This isn't just about ignoring someone, it is about choosing themselves over chaos. For the first time, they allow themselves to believe that their happiness is not reliant on someone who cannot meet them with the same energy. That shift may start small, but it grows with each day they choose not to fall back into the old cycle. The avoidant may feel confused by this new behavior because they have always known the anxious to be the one who overextends. They may interpret this silence as indifference, or they may begin to question whether the anxious has truly detached. Either way, it unsettles them. The very dynamic they relied on for comfort begins to change, and in that shift, they realize the anxious no longer exists in the same role. The avoidant now has to decide whether to step forward or risk losing the connection altogether. This moment is critical because it is the first time the avoidant feels the weight of responsibility that was once carried entirely by the anxious. For the anxious, this realization that their worth isn't tied to chasing someone is deeply empowering. They start to feel a sense of control they never experienced before. No longer are they waiting endlessly for crumbs of attention. No longer are they bending themselves to fit into the avoidant's comfort zone. They start to stand firm in the truth that love is not proven through desperation, but through mutual respect and effort. This inner clarity builds their confidence and allows them to raise their standards, not just with the avoidant, but in every relationship that follows. They learn that it is not selfish to protect their energy, but necessary if they want to build connections that are healthy and fulfilling. The silence of not chasing also helps the anxious rebuild trust with themselves. They begin to notice that they can resist impulses, that they can endure discomfort, and that they can stand firm in their boundaries. Every time they choose not to reach out, not to explain themselves again, and not to overgive, they strengthen this inner muscle of self-control. They see that life continues without the constant anxiety of whether the avoidant will respond, and in that continuation, they learn resilience. This resilience becomes their foundation for future relationships because they now know that their stability comes from within, not from how another person treats them. The avoidant, meanwhile, is confronted with a new reality. Their distance no longer guarantees pursuit. Their silence no longer ensures control. They are now the ones sitting in the discomfort of wondering what comes next. This shift doesn't just challenge them, it exposes the fragility of the dynamic they once relied on. Without the anxious pouring all the energy into maintaining the connection, the avoidant begins to feel the emptiness that comes with detachment. It forces them to reconsider their role, to see that relationships cannot survive on one person's effort alone. For the anxious, this process is not about revenge or manipulation. It is about awakening to the truth of their own worth. They realize that their role is not to carry the weight of someone else's fears or avoidance. Their role is to show up as themselves, to love without losing themselves, and to protect their peace when someone else cannot meet them halfway. This realization reshapes not just the dynamic with the avoidant, but the way the anxious views love, connection, and their own identity. It is a shift that begins with silence but expands into every area of their life, reminding them that their value has always existed, even when they were too busy chasing to see it. This shift forces the avoidant into a place they never wanted to be, a place where they are confronted with the consequences of their own detachment. For so long, they operated with the belief that they could withdraw whenever they felt overwhelmed, and the anxious would be there to close the gap, to soothe the tension, and to carry the emotional weight of the relationship. That dynamic gave them comfort, because it meant they could maintain their distance without ever truly risking the connection. But when the anxious decides to stop chasing, when they choose silence instead of pursuit, the avoidant is suddenly forced to confront a reality they have been avoiding all along. They now have to either step forward and engage or risk losing what they thought would always be there, and this realization shakes the very foundation of their patterns. The anxious, by stepping back, doesn't just reclaim their own peace. They unintentionally create a mirror for the avoidant. That mirror reflects back all the times the avoidant chose distance over closeness, withdrawal over communication, and silence over vulnerability. The avoidant is not used to seeing their behavior so clearly, because the anxious usually absorbs the impact and softens the edges. But now, with no one running in to repair the damage, they are left face to face with the emptiness their actions create. This can be an incredibly disorienting experience because it disrupts the balance they thought they controlled. What once felt like safety now feels like loss, and that discomfort can no longer be ignored. In many cases, the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, fear. Not the fear of closeness that usually drives their behavior, but the fear of abandonment, the fear of being left behind, the fear of realizing they may have pushed too far. That fear often comes as a shock because they were so used to believing the anxious would always be there, no matter what. When the anxious ignores them, that belief is shattered, and the avoidant begins to feel what the anxious has always felt. The uncertainty of not knowing where the relationship stands, the ache of waiting for someone to reach out, the discomfort of not being reassured. This role reversal forces them to recognize the cost of their avoidance in a way that words or arguments never could. For the anxious, this shift is not about punishing the avoidant. It is about choosing themselves. By no longer feeding into the cycle of pursuit, they create space for the avoidant to make a choice of their own. The avoidant can either rise to the occasion and take responsibility for the connection, or they can continue to retreat and risk losing it entirely. Either way, the anxious has broken free from the old dynamic, and in doing so, they regain a sense of control that was once lost. This control is not about dominating the other person, but about refusing to let their own identity be defined by someone else's inconsistency. It is a quiet but powerful declaration that they will no longer beg for love or prove their worth to someone unwilling to meet them halfway. As the avoidant begins to feel the absence of pursuit, they may attempt to test the anxious, sending small signals or mixed messages to see if the old pattern can be restored. But when the anxious doesn't respond in the same way, the avoidant faces a difficult truth. The power dynamic has shifted. They no longer hold the security of knowing the anxious will do all the work. This shift challenges them to rethink their approach, to confront their own fears of intimacy, and to decide whether maintaining distance is worth the risk of losing something real. For the avoidant, this moment can be the catalyst for change, but only if they are willing to face the vulnerability they have been running from. For the anxious, the silence becomes a new kind of strength. It is not coldness or indifference, but a boundary that protects their energy. They begin to understand that love should not come at the cost of self-respect, and connection should not demand constant self-sacrifice. By ignoring the avoidant, they are not shutting down their heart. They are choosing to align their actions with their own worth. This realization transforms their perspective on relationships, teaching them that true connection is built on reciprocity, not desperation. Each day they resist the urge to fall back into the old cycle. They reinforce the truth that they deserve more than someone who only shows up when they are about to lose them. The avoidant, left with this silence, must finally confront the decision they have avoided for so long. Either they step up and take responsibility for building a real connection, or they retreat and watch the anxious walk away for good. What makes this shift so powerful is that it exposes the reality both have been avoiding. The anxious cannot carry the relationship alone, and the avoidant cannot keep hiding behind distance without paying the price.